Warriors who made armies. Tremble. 5 stories of history's most feared fighters. 1. The Varangian Guard. Northmen who became the emperor's shadow. A man walks into the throne room of Constantinople carrying an axe the size of a small child. He is blonde, blue-eyed, 6 feet tall, in a world where most men barely reach 5.5. He does not bow. He does not smile. He stands at the right hand of the Byzantine Emperor and watches every face in the room with the flat patience of a man who has crossed half the known world to be exactly where he is. This is the Varangian Guard, and in the year 1000 AD, there is no more dangerous man alive. To understand how Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon warriors ended up as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor, the most powerful ruler in the Christian world, you have to understand what Constantinople was. It was the largest city in Europe, with possibly 500,000 inhabitants at its peak, when London had perhaps 20,000. It was a city of marble, silk, gold mosaics, and an administrative bureaucracy so sophisticated it made the rest of Europe look like it was operating from caves, and it was surrounded by enemies on every side. The Byzantine Emperor needed guards, but not just any guards. He needed men who had no political connections inside the empire, men who could not be bribed by noble families, men who had no cousins waiting to inherit a title if they happened to accidentally let the emperor fall off a balcony. He needed foreigners. Specifically, he needed foreigners who were terrifying. In 988 AD, the Emperor Basil II made a deal with the Viking prince Vladimir of Kiev. Vladimir would send 6,000 Varangian warriors, Norse, Aish, Yiyimots, Danish and Rus fighters, in exchange for a royal marriage alliance. Those 6,000 men became the nucleus of the Varangian Guard. What made them different from every other imperial guard in history? First, they were volunteers from the outer edge of the known world, men who had rowed across the Baltic, portaged their boats through Russian rivers, and navigated the Black Sea to reach a city they had heard of only in stories. That journey alone filtered out the weak and the uncommitted. By the time a Varangian arrived at the gates of Constantinople, he had already proven something about himself. Second, they operated under a code that was distinctly alien to Byzantine political culture. In a court where betrayal was so normalized it was practically a career option, the Varangians brought the Norse concept of personal loyalty to an almost irrational extreme. Their oath to the emperor was not a political calculation. It was a sacred bond. Breaking it was not just illegal. It was the kind of thing that made a man an outcast from his own people, a nothing, a man without honor, which in Norse culture was a fate considered worse than death. Third, their weapons. The Varangian Axe, the broad-bladed Danish axe on a handle that could reach 5 feet, was a weapon that Byzantine soldiers had simply never trained to fight against. The empire's armies were built around the sword, the spear, and the composite bow. The great sweeping cuts of the Varangian axe, which could shear through armor, shield, and limb in a single stroke, required entirely different defensive tactics. Enemy commanders who faced them for the first time frequently made catastrophic mistakes in the first moments of engagement, and in the first moments of battle, mistakes are permanent. The training regimen of the Varangian Guard is less documented than, say, the Templars, but what we know is significant. They maintained their traditional Norse fighting techniques while also absorbing Byzantine tactical doctrine. How to hold a palace corridor, how to protect a moving target in a crowd, how to function as a personal security detail in an environment where the threat could come from a kitchen servant as easily as from an assassin. They were, in modern terms, both special operations soldiers and close protection specialists. Their reputation spread rapidly through the Islamic world as well. Arab chroniclers, who described the Byzantines fighting with the axe-bearing barbarians, noted with some amazement that these men did not retreat in the normal sense. When the guard formed its defensive line, it held. When it advanced, it did not stop until it had gone through whatever was in front of it, or until it had no men left standing. This was not bravado. It was structural. A Varangian who fled while his brothers fell was going home to a community that would never let him forget it. The Guard's most famous engagement, or at least the most dramatically documented, came at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081, when the Norman forces of Robert Guiscard invaded Byzantine territory. The Varangians formed the heavy infantry corps of the Byzantine response. They fought so ferociously that the Norman cavalry, which had routed the rest of the Byzantine army, could not break them. Even after the battle was militarily lost, the Varangian detachment reportedly retreated to a church, barricaded themselves inside, and had to be burned out. The Normans, who were themselves considered among the most dangerous warriors in Europe, were apparently so impressed or disturbed that chronicles of the period make specific note of the incident. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, a new wave of recruits joined the Guard. Anglo-Saxon warriors who had lost everything to William the Conqueror and had literally nothing left in England. These men had an additional layer of motivation. They were not just fulfilling an oath or seeking fortune. They were men in exile, men who had watched their world destroyed, men who had crossed Europe and the entire length of the Byzantine Empire's western borders to find somewhere to point their axes. That specific quality of grief-fueled commitment added something to the Guard that pure mercenary motivation could not replicate. The Guard existed in various forms for nearly 5 centuries, from the late 10th century to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. When the city finally fell to Mehmed II's Ottoman forces, the last Varangians reportedly died at their posts in the palace, doing what they had been doing for 500 years, standing between the emperor and whatever was coming through the door. The emperor they were protecting was already dead. They apparently didn't adjust their orders based on that information. 2. The Janissaries, slaves who became the most powerful army in the world. Take a boy. He is 8 years old. His village is in the Balkans, or Anatolia, or Greece. His father is a farmer, or a craftsman. He speaks no Turkish. He has never held a weapon. He does not know where the Ottoman capital is, or what the Sultan looks like. Now make him the most feared soldier on earth. This was the Devshirme system. Every few years, Ottoman officials traveled through the Christian villages of the empire and selected boys, healthy, intelligent, physically promising boys, for a program that would take them entirely from their families and transform them into something their parents could not have imagined. The boys were converted to Islam, educated in Ottoman culture and language, trained in military arts from childhood, and inducted into a force called the Janissaries, the new army, the Janissaries. The system sounds brutal by modern standards, and in many ways it was, but it produced something that no feudal army in the world could produce: professional soldiers with no loyalty to anything except the Sultan and the corps. They had no families to go home to, no lands to protect, no noble patron to answer to. They were, in the most complete sense possible, soldiers. Only soldiers. nothing but soldiers. The training began immediately after selection and lasted years. Boys learned horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, the use of the bow, and the early firearms that the Ottomans adopted faster and more effectively than almost any European power. They learned to read and write when most European soldiers were illiterate. They studied Islamic theology, Ottoman history, and military strategy. By the time a Janissary was inducted into active service, typically in his late teens or early 20s, he had spent more time in formal training than most European knights accumulated in a lifetime. The result was a level of tactical sophistication that genuinely shocked the armies they faced. European knights of the 15th century were accustomed to fighting by a set of rules: the charge, the melee, the possibility of ransom. The Janissaries operated on a completely different logic. They used firearms when European armies still considered guns a novelty best left to lower-class soldiers. They coordinated infantry, cavalry, and artillery in combined arms operations that anticipated Napoleonic tactics by 3 centuries. They held formations under fire in ways that required a quality of discipline that European armies of the period simply did not have. At the Battle of Varna in 1444, a crusading army of European knights, flushed with early success, broke their own battle plan when the Hungarian king charged ahead of his forces. The Janissaries, who had been under heavy pressure, held their formation, absorbed the charge, and killed the king. The crusade collapsed. Europe was stunned. The story of Varna circulated through European courts for decades as a cautionary tale about what happened when undisciplined chivalric courage met professional military discipline. The Janissaries also had something that most armies lacked: institutional identity. They belonged to regiments, ortas, that had their own histories, traditions, and fierce internal loyalty. A Janissary's identity was first Janissary, and only after that, anything else. When ortas competed against each other in training or in ceremonial contexts, the rivalry was intense, almost tribal. But in battle, that same intensity became unit cohesion of a quality that enemies consistently described as unnerving. Their relationship with the Sultan was complicated in ways that would eventually destroy them. Because they had no outside loyalties, they became the ultimate power behind the throne. Sultans who pleased them ruled. Sultans who displeased them were deposed or killed. Between 1622 and 1807, the Janissaries were directly involved in the deposition of multiple sultans. They were simultaneously the most loyal and the most dangerous force in the empire, loyal to the institution of the Sultanate, dangerous to any individual sultan who tried to modernize or limit them. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II finally moved against them. He had spent years building alternative military forces. When the Janissaries rose in their traditional revolt, overturning their soup cauldrons, the symbol of rebellion, he unleashed artillery on their barracks. Thousands died. The survivors were executed, exiled, or absorbed into the new army. 5 centuries of the most effective military force in the world ended in a single night in Istanbul that the Ottomans called the auspicious incident. What the Janissaries left behind was not just a military legacy. They left a model. The idea that professional soldiers, trained from youth with no competing loyalties, educated comprehensively, and equipped with the best available technology, could defeat any army regardless of its size. That idea influenced military thinking across 3 continents and several centuries. Every attempt at creating a professional standing army in the centuries that followed was, consciously or not, attempting to reproduce something the Ottomans had already done. 3. The Swiss pike, squares, peasants who killed the concept of knightly warfare. The year is 1315. A column of Austrian knights, armored, mounted, the finest military force that money and nobility can produce, is moving through a narrow pass at Morgarten in the Swiss Alps. They are heading to suppress a rebellion by Swiss peasant communities who have had the extraordinary audacity to refuse Austrian governance. The knights are not particularly worried. These are farmers, herdsmen, woodcutters, men without armor, without war horses, without the decades of training that knighthood requires. This will be a police action, not a battle. What happens next changes the entire concept of European warfare. The Swiss are waiting above the pass with logs, boulders, and halberds, a weapon that combines the reach of a spear with the chopping power of an axe and a hook that can pull a mounted knight from his horse. As the Austrian column enters the narrowest section of the pass, unable to maneuver, unable to deploy in proper formation, the logs and boulders come down the hillside. The column bunches, collapses, and suddenly armored knights, the most expensive, most prestigious military units in the world, are being dragged off their horses by men in rough wool and killed with agricultural implements. The Swiss lose virtually no one. The Austrians are massacred. Morgarten was not an accident. It was the product of a specific military culture that the Swiss Confederation had been developing for generations, a culture built on two principles that were almost revolutionary in the feudal world. First, every man fights. Not just knights, not just men who can afford armor. Every man capable of carrying a weapon is a soldier. Second, the unit matters more than the individual. The Swiss pike square, a dense formation of men carrying pikes up to 18 feet long, was the most disciplined infantry formation in Europe for nearly 2 centuries. The key word is disciplined. A pike square works only if every man holds his position, moves at the same speed as the men around him, keeps his pike aligned with his neighbors. One man who breaks and runs creates a gap. A gap becomes a hole. A hole becomes the death of everyone. So the Swiss trained for cohesion, the way the Templars trained for individual courage, obsessively, continuously, at the level of physical reflex. They drilled the movements of the square until holding formation was not a conscious decision, but an automatic response. They created internal systems of social pressure so powerful that breaking from the square was not just militarily prohibited, but socially catastrophic. A man who broke from the square was not just a coward. He had killed his neighbors, his cousins, the men his sons would grow up beside. In Swiss communities where military service was communal and deeply tied to civic identity, that was a weight that followed a man forever. The Swiss also developed something unusual for the period, a culture of aggression. Most medieval armies preferred defensive positions when possible. The Swiss actively sought to attack. Their tactical doctrine was built around the rapid advance, moving the pike square forward at a pace that most opponents found startling for a foot formation and the shock of contact. They did not wait to be charged. They charged. At Grandson in 1476, the Swiss faced the army of Charles the Bold of Burgundy, who was attempting to expand his territory at the expense of the Confederation. Charles had one of the largest, best-equipped armies in Europe, including heavy cavalry, Swiss-style pike infantry he had hired, and artillery. The battle began with the Swiss advancing so rapidly that the Burgundian forces still forming up simply did not have time to complete their deployment. The result was a collapse so sudden and so complete that the Burgundians left essentially their entire baggage train behind, including Charles's personal treasury, his jewels, his ceremonial robes, and, most embarrassing, his seals of state. 3 months later, at Merton, Charles tried again. He had rebuilt his army. He had artillery. He had selected a defensive position. The Swiss advanced again, this time through difficult terrain, and hit the Burgundian line while it was still adjusting to their approach. Charles lost between 8,000 and 10,000 men. The battle lasted approximately an hour. At Nancy in 1477, Charles himself died in the fighting. His body found days later in a frozen pond, his face so damaged it could only be identified by his doctor and by a distinctive set of long fingernails. The man who had dreamed of recreating the Burgundian kingdom died at the hands of men his class had spent a century dismissing as peasants. The Swiss success shattered something fundamental in European military thinking. For centuries, the assumption had been that war was the business of the nobility, that knights, with their war horses, their armor, their lifetime of training, represented a military ceiling that common soldiers simply could not reach. The Swiss demonstrated repeatedly, in battle after battle, that disciplined, well-trained infantry, with the right weapons and the right tactics, could not just match mounted knights, but consistently destroy them. Within a generation, European armies were scrambling to recruit Swiss mercenaries who became the most sought-after professional soldiers in Europe and to copy Swiss methods. The Swiss pike square directly influenced the Spanish tercio, which dominated European warfare for another century. The concept of the military revolution, the shift from feudal levies to professional trained standing armies, arguably begins at Morgarten in 1315. Before, the Janissary assassins, the order that made kings afraid to sleep. A sultan opens a letter. Inside, there are no words. There is a dagger, and attached to it is a single line. "We are closer to you than this blade." The letter is from Hassan-i-Sabah, and the Sultan, despite having an army of tens of thousands, reads it and does exactly what Hassan wants. The Nizari Ismaili state, which operated from mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria between roughly 1090 and 1275, was tiny by any conventional measure. The Alamat fortress, Hassan's base in the Alborz Mountains, controlled a small network of strongholds scattered through difficult terrain. In terms of territory, soldiers, or resources, the Nizaris could not compete with the Seljuk Sultanate, the Abbasid Caliphate, or the Crusader states that surrounded them. So they competed differently. The force they developed, called in Arabic Fidain, the devoted ones, later garbled by Crusader sources into assassins, operated on a principle that was almost philosophically elegant. If you cannot defeat an army, remove the man giving the army its orders, not through conventional military campaigns, which the Nizaris could not sustain, but through the selective elimination of specific individuals, viziers, sultans, generals, crusader lords, rival religious leaders, anyone whose removal would change the strategic situation. The training of a fidai was comprehensive in ways that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with infiltration. A fidai might spend years in an enemy court, establishing a cover identity as a merchant, a craftsman, a religious scholar. He learned languages. He studied the target's habits, schedules, security arrangements. He identified the moment of maximum vulnerability and the approach that minimized his own exposure. The psychological architecture of the program was as important as the tactical training. Hassani Sabah built a system of belief and loyalty so complete that Fida'in were genuinely willing, not reluctantly willing, but actively willing, to accept their own death as a consequence of a successful mission. The historical record contains multiple accounts of Nizari operatives who made no attempt to escape after completing an assassination, who stood waiting for the guards to kill them. This was not suicide in the sense of self-destruction. It was, in their framework, the completion of a sacred duty. That willingness to die, rather than flee, transformed the tactical calculation entirely. A conventional assassin needs to escape, which creates operational constraints. He must choose locations and moments that offer escape routes. He must weigh mission success against survival. A Fida'i who had made peace with dying had none of those constraints. He could act in the middle of a crowd, in a throne room, at a public ceremony, anywhere the target was present, regardless of what the exit options looked like. The effect on the political culture of the period was profound and strange. Leaders who faced Nizari attention began surrounding themselves with ever more elaborate security. They changed their routines constantly. They moved locations unpredictably. Some reportedly slept in armor. Some refused to meet anyone they hadn't known for years. The psychological pressure of not knowing when, where, or in what form the threat would appear was in many ways more operationally effective than the assassinations themselves. Saladin, the same Saladin who systematically executed captured Templars, woke one morning in his tent in 1176 to find a poisoned dagger stuck in the ground next to his head and a note nearby. He had survived whatever attempt had been made, but only because the Fidai had apparently chosen to demonstrate capability rather than complete the act. The message was political rather than lethal. We could have done this. We chose not to. Consider that. Saladin subsequently made peace with the Nizari leader Rashid al-Din Sinan, rather than continue the conflict. The Nizaris were eventually destroyed, or nearly so, by the Mongol invasions of the 1250s, which simply had no patience for the psychological strategies that had protected the order for over a century. Hulagu Khan's Mongol forces methodically besieged Alamut in 1256 and reduced it. The Grand Library there, which reportedly contained irreplaceable manuscripts accumulated over 2 centuries, was destroyed. The Nizari state in Persia effectively ceased to exist. What survived was the reputation, which spread far beyond what the historical record of their actual operations justifies. The word assassin entered every European language. The legend of the order, some versions of which are almost entirely fictional, including the famous Garden of Paradise story that Marco Polo reported, became a template for secret societies, covert operations, and the idea of the elite specialized operative that echoes through military and intelligence history to the present day. Whether or not the legends are accurate, they tell us something about how the Nizaris were perceived, as an organization that had figured out a way to punch far above its weight through a combination of training, dedication, and the weaponization of fear itself. The samurai of the Sengoku period, a century of war, and the men it made. Japan, between 1467 and 1615, was in a state of near-continuous warfare. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, was a century and a half in which the feudal lords of the country fought each other with a sustained ferocity that transformed Japanese military culture in ways that still echo in the modern world. The samurai who emerged from this period were not the romanticized figures of later literature. They were professional military men who had spent their entire lives in or preparing for active combat, fighting in campaigns that often did not pause for seasons. In a country where the terrain, mountains, rice paddies, coastal inlets made military operations uniquely brutal, and where the technology of warfare was changing rapidly with the introduction of firearms. The foundation of samurai training was the concept of mastery through repetition, carried to an extreme that has no real parallel in Western military tradition. A samurai might practice a single sword cut, one specific movement, 10,000 times before his instructor considered it adequate. Not 10,000 times over a career, but 10,000 times as a prerequisite for beginning the study of combinations. The physical conditioning required was extraordinary. Morning practices before dawn, evening practices after the day's other duties, constant attention to balance, breathing, the positioning of the feet and hips that determine the power and accuracy of a cut. But the physical training was inseparable from a psychological framework that the Sengoku period intensified and codified. The concept of accepting death, not just intellectually accepting that death was possible, but genuinely integrating the certainty of eventual death into one's moment-to-moment awareness, was central to the mental preparation of a samurai. The logic was practical as well as philosophical. A man who is afraid of dying will hesitate at the critical moment. A man who has already accepted death has no hesitation. And in sword fighting, hesitation is typically the last mistake a person makes. This framework produced something that opponents consistently described as unnerving. In single combat, experienced samurai did not appear to be fighting defensively. They appeared to be managing the timing and location of their own death while simultaneously ending yours. The distinction sounds abstract until you are on the receiving end of it, at which point it is extremely concrete. The Sengoku period also saw the development of large-scale coordinated warfare that transformed the samurai from primarily an individual dueling tradition into a professional officer and heavy infantry force within armies that could number in the tens of thousands. Generals like Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu reorganized Japanese armies systematically, creating combined arms forces that integrated the traditional samurai combat skills with pike infantry, castle warfare, logistic systems, and, critically, firearms. Nobunaga's adoption of the arquebus at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575 is sometimes presented as the moment firearms defeated the samurai cavalry charge. The real story is more interesting. Nobunaga deployed his arquebusiers in rotating ranks behind wooden palisades, a tactical innovation that maximized the relatively slow rate of fire of early firearms and neutralized the speed advantage of cavalry. The samurai warriors of the Takeda clan, charging as they had been trained to charge, ran into a volume of fire that the tactic had never before generated. The charge failed, but the officers organizing that charge were themselves samurai. The tactical innovation that defeated the traditional cavalry charge was designed by men from the same military tradition. What the Sengoku period ultimately produced, after 150 years of continuous war, was a class of men whose entire identity, from childhood education through daily practice to their understanding of death and meaning, was organized around military excellence. When the Tokugawa shogunate unified Japan and ended the period of active warfare in the early 17th century, this class found itself in a world that no longer needed what it had been built to do. The subsequent 3 centuries of Tokugawa peace forced the samurai to transform, becoming administrators, scholars, teachers, while maintaining the forms of their military identity. The martial arts traditions that emerged from Sengoku period training, kenjutsu, jujutsu, the roots of what would become judo and modern kendo, were not just preserved for cultural reasons. They were maintained because the men who practiced them genuinely believed that the physical and psychological disciplines they encoded were valuable independent of their original context. They were right. The Sengoku samurai did not leave behind territories or institutions in the way the Templars or the Janissaries did. They left behind a set of practices for the cultivation of human performance under pressure that continues to be studied and practiced worldwide, centuries after the last battle of the Warring States period was fought. What these five have in common, separated by geography, religion, culture, and centuries: the Varangian Guard, the Janissaries, the Swiss pike squares, the Nizari Fidain, and the Sengoku samurai, were built on the same core insight. Exceptional military performance is not primarily about physical strength or even individual skill. It is about psychology. Each of these forces solved the problem of fear differently. The Varangians used oath culture and exile identity. The Janissaries used institutional belonging and childhood formation. The Swiss used social pressure and communal obligation. The Nizaris used religious belief and acceptance of death as mission completion. The samurai used philosophical practice and the meditative integration of mortality, but all of them were trying to solve the same problem. How do you take a human being who is biologically programmed to survive and train them to function effectively in the one environment, the battlefield, where survival instinct is the primary obstacle to performance? The answer, in every case, was not to suppress the instinct for survival, but to replace the thing being protected. The Varangian protected his honor and his oath. The Janissary protected his core and his Sultan. The Swiss soldier protected his neighbors and his community's freedom. The Fidai protected his religious mission. The samurai protected his mastery and his name. When you give a man something he values more than his life, you have not made him reckless. You have made him, in the specific context of combat, genuinely fearless. And genuinely fearless men, fighting in coordinated units with good equipment and serious training, are difficult to stop. History documents this repeatedly. The moment an opposing commander realized he was facing one of these forces, the calculation changed. It was no longer about how to win. It was about how to survive the encounter with manageable losses. Sometimes it was about finding a different route. That is the legacy these warriors left. Not just their victories, their famous battles, their entries in history books, but the demonstration, proven across centuries and cultures, that the most powerful weapon ever deployed on a battlefield was not a sword, a pike, a musket, or an axe. It was a mind that had already decided it was not afraid.